Ma'am, with regard to this subjectification, I know that's probably not a word, but taking the objective word and turning it subjective, if you will, and knowing the approach that was used with regard to Ms. Laviolette, and I'm just talking about not anything specific, but the actual opinion that may be rendered on this type of approach. Is that something that you believe would lead to a valid opinion if you are taking words that are objective and then making them subjective?
It's unreliable.
And why is it unreliable?
Because in that situation, then there would be no objective data that's being relied upon. Then that would mean that the approach is completely subjective.
So, for example, if we go back to exhibit number 456 that we've talked about already, and the approach were to change or make subjective what is written there in the first sentence, would your opinion then, would it be a valid opinion, irrespective of what the opinion is? Do you believe it would be a valid opinion if you were to read, for example, the journals and then change the words? Would that still render, in your opinion, a valid opinion?
Objection is characterized as a testimony as to changing the words in the journal.
Overruled. You may answer.
It would make it subjective and unreliable.
Is there, for example, any course that you've ever taken when you were studying to become a psychologist that indicates that that is an appropriate approach in a forensic evaluation?
No.
You indicated that you did administer some tests, and I think that you indicated that you administered one, the TSI, and we talked about that, right?
Correct.
You also administered other tests, right?
Correct.
What are the other tests?
I administered what's called the abbreviation for it is RAT, a Wide Range Achievement Test.
Well, let's talk about that one before we get done with the acronyms. The RAT, or W-R-A-T, why did you administer that?
The self-report measures, such as the TSI and another test that I gave, which is referred to as the MMPI, there's certain reading thresholds that are required in order for someone to take the test independently. So I wanted to make sure that Ms. Arias met that threshold so that I could give her the test and that it would be valid.
So in other words, you wanted to see, as what appears to be saying, you wanted to see if she could read. Yes. At a certain level, right?
So I gave her the reading subtest.
Right, and that's the W-R-A-T. That tells you that she could read and could take the other.
All right, we're moving on now to the test that Janeen DeMarte administered to Jodi Arias. We'll find out about that when we come back.
You wanted to see if she could read. Yes. At a certain level, right?
So I gave her the reading subtest.
Right, and that's the W-R-A-T. That tells you that she could read and could take the other tests, right?
Those were my findings.
And how is that test put together? I mean, does it just ask questions, or explain a little bit about that test?
It's a very brief reading test. It's just a matter of presenting her with a list of words and asking her to read it out loud to me. All right.
Then what other tests did you administer?
I also administered what's called the WAIS. It's an intelligence test.
And that's W-A-I-S?
Correct.
Do you know what that acronym stands for?
Wexler Adult Intelligence.
And why were you, what does this test measure? What is it that it's measuring?
It's a test of overall intelligence.
And so you administered it. Are you familiar with the term IQ?
Yes, it's the same as intelligence.
And so this is an IQ test?
That is correct.
And this IQ test, is it just one straight IQ, or is it divided into 4 subparts? Or explain to me about this.
Sure. The way that the test works is that there's an overall intelligence IQ of the individual, and there are 4 different domains that comprise this overall intelligence score.
And what are the 4 domains that are involved?
There's one domain called verbal comprehension, essentially the person's ability to verbally formulate words, their word knowledge.
How about the other domains?
Another one is called the perceptual reasoning domain. You can think about it as someone's ability to put together puzzles. So it's essentially nonverbal intelligence.
The third?
Another is called working memory, the ability to take in different pieces of information and keep it in your short-term memory while you utilize that information in some sort of way.
And with regard to this short-term memory test, what result did you get?
She performed well on it.
Was there ever an indication there that somehow she had any problems such that her memory was affected?
No.
How about the last one?
The last domain is called processing speed. Essentially what that tells us is how fast someone can think.
So what was her overall score or IQ score?
She scored relatively high in the above average range.
And what was that score, do you know?
May I reference my records?
Sure, just give it to me, however.
Judge, I'm going to object to beyond rebuttal, not rebuttal.
Overruled. Look at Exhibit 621, reviewed it, review it. Once you've reviewed it, please give it back. What was the overall IQ score?
The overall IQ is 119.
And did she achieve a score on any of these 4 domains that was in the very superior range?
Yes, and the first domain that I described was the verbal comprehension.
And what did she score there?
I believe it's 136.
Take a look at it and, okay. And when you say that's very superior, what does that mean?
Objection, not rebuttal.
Overruled. What does that mean?
It's the highest possible that you can get in terms of descriptor domains, so it's very high.
Okay, we'd heard previously in the trial, Jodi Arias said the IQ, that was the intimation, that IQ is similar to Einstein's. Well, maybe not quite, but she scored well on these tests. What does that mean to this trial? We'll hit that pause button for.
Did you also administer another test?
Yes,
What was that?
what's called the MMPI,
And what does that stand for?
the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory.
And personality inventory, what is it that test is supposed to measure?
The MMPI is one of the most commonly used tests in forensic settings and overall. It's a measure of general psychopathology, so the presence of mental illness, and general personality characteristics.
Is that normed against the general population, or is that normed against those that have mental health issues and may be in a facility?
The normative population is an average typical group.
So, and you say that it's personality. What is it that, when you say personality, what is it that it's looking at?
Well, personality is characteristics that we all have within us, and it's how we relate to people, it's how we relate to the world. It's carried within us at all times. It's who we are, it's what makes us up as people.
So with regard to personality, for example, if the prosecutor, let's just assume somebody's a jerk, for lack of a better term, is that personality? Is there such a thing as being a jerk?
And not using that verbiage.
Judge, may I have permission?
Overruled.
Ma'am, we were talking about this issue involving, well, Mike, can you read that back? The question. All right, I'll look at this ask.
I'll look for it.
We were talking about MMPI. Let's talk about the MMPI. One of the things that we were talking about was personality in terms of the MMPI, correct?
That's correct.
And in terms of a personality, and I started to say jerk, do you remember that? With regard to personality, when does an individual, and you said that jerk isn't exactly what you mean, what is it exactly that you mean with regard to a personality?
I was just saying that I would that's not a terminology that I would use.
Okay, what would be the terminology that you would use?
A potential personality trait would be aggressiveness.
All right, so if you have a, let's say, aggressiveness, would manipulation or being manipulated, is that a character trait?
Yes.
So let's say that, for example, when does this personality trait start for an individual? Does it start when they're 30? Does it start when they're 15? When do these personality traits start?
Personality is developed throughout life. It's thought to develop relatively early as a child, and it's referred to as temperament, then develops into personality. So we could see it at a very, very young age.
When you say very young age, what do the studies show is a very, very young age?
Starting from toddler years, that's the beginnings of it, and continues to develop throughout childhood, adolescence, and becomes much more firm in adulthood.
How is that different from, let's say, somebody who is in a situation that is not such a good situation, and they're depressed because of that situation? Is that the same thing as a characteristic?
No, that would be much more situational, and I would determine the difference between that by looking at patterns of behavior.
So are you familiar with the terms Axis 1 and Axis 2?
Yes.
What is Axis 1?
There's a diagnostic system that's used in the Diagnostical and Statistical Manual, so essentially what we use to make diagnoses. Axis 1 disorders are thought to be much more transient disorders. They're called clinical disorders. That's not necessarily the case. It falls under Axis 1, but it differentiates from Axis 2 in that Axis 2 captures what are called personality disorders, in addition to other spectrums that tend to be more long-lasting, like mental retardation.
So, for example, if somebody is in jail and they manifest a certain profile, is that an Axis 1 profile or an Axis 2 profile?
What profile are you referring to?
Well, let's talk about somebody who, let's say, is depressed and they're in jail. Is that a characteristic, or is that just a mood that may pass?
We're talking about personality. If there's no indication that there was any kind of depression in the past, then I would label it as non-personality.
And so the MMPI that we were talking about, it measures the personality, correct?
Right.
And how is that important in making an assessment in a forensic setting?
Because it gives me the opportunity to look at personality features that may be present in the individual in terms of in a maladaptive way.
When you say in a maladaptive way, what does that mean?
So, as a psychologist, when I diagnose someone with a personality disorder, what it means is that the personality trait has essentially become maladaptive. It's not helpful to them. It causes either distress with them or the people around them, or causes some sort of impairment in their life as a result of it.
And how many questions are involved in this MMPI?
There's a lot. There's 567.
And this administration of the test, explain to us how it is that you administer this test and whether or not there is a bubble sheet that's associated with this.
There's a answer sheet, and then there's the actual test itself with the test items. I gave it the answer sheet and both of the items to Miss Arias and asked her to complete it, and asked her to read the directions that are on there that indicate that she's to answer these true or false questions as they typically relate to who she is. Are they mostly true or mostly false of her?
Would you ever have a situation where you just, for example, read the test to her and then marked on a legal pad what the responses were, rather than using the bubble sheet?
No.
Have you ever done that?
No.
Do you know anybody else, anybody that has ever done that?
No.
And so you did receive, once you get done with that, how is this scored? Do you do it manually, or how is that done?
Now, I put it through a computer system so as to ensure that there's no errors. It actually makes me score it twice to make sure that there was no error while I was entering it.
So once you get these scores, is it just one big score, let's say 100, 50, 75, like we saw with the MCMI, or is it something else? What do you get?
It's somewhat similar to the MCMI in that there's a number of different what are called scales that are identified on there.
Let me stop you there. When you say scales, are you talking about sections, for lack of a better term? Is it a section that you look at, or is it something else?
That's one way to look at it. It groups essentially the answers into meaningful categories. That's a better way, categories such as depression or tendency to somaticize, meaning that experience psychological distress through somatic physical symptoms.